So it turns out that Macbeth wasn't the bad guy. If you've read or watched Shakespeare's Macbeth, you'll think of him as a murderous warlord and king, but not all of this is true. What if I told you he was not only the rightful King of Scots, but also the king of a kingdom that you've never heard of? Today we're going to look at how the King of Scots killed off Macbeth's family. Now, who was Macbeth? More than being a fictional character in one of Shakespeare's plays, Macbeth was a real king of Moray, an early medieval kingdom in what is today Scotland. He was a warlord who lived slightly before the Norman invasion of England in the 11th century. He was son of Finlech mac Ruadhí, king of Moray. His mother was descended from Malcolm II of House Alpin, the house who would be his rivals for life. Think Game of Thrones, just a bit more Scotland. Now, the Kings of Moray were independent in what is today northeast Scotland, with later Scottish chroniclers referring to them as earls or mornemers, the Gaelic term for an earl. This was to cover up the fact that they were actually kings, separate from the Kings of Scots and sometimes over-kings of the Scots. It would have been embarrassing for the chroniclers to share the fact that there were two competing dynasties for Scotland's throne, the House of Alpin and the House of Moray, and the King of Scots competed with another dynasty whose authority rivaled with them. This therefore sets some of the scene for understanding the dynastic rivalries and conflicts which we're about to cover. Now we set the scene. Macbeth was descended from Malcolm II, who had 3 daughters and no sons, but each of these daughters had a son who had a claim towards the kingdom of Alba. These young men may have known each other while being at Malcolm's court, each carefully watching the other and knowing that they had a claim to the kingdom. These men were Duncan, Thorfinn and Macbeth. Thorfinn the Mighty was the Lord of Orkney. After his father had died when he was a child, he had inherited the earldom and co-ruled it with his half-brothers. His grandfather had granted Caithness to him so that a member of the family would influence that area of Scotland. Macbeth's father had been the King of Moray before him, and he'd married one of Duncan's daughters, but had been murdered by his cousin. Macbeth avenged his father and married his great cousin's widow, who also had a claim to the throne of Scots. Family dynamics are always complicated in early medieval Europe. Moray was an ancient kingdom with its roots going back to the Pictish kingdom of Fortu, which had been conquered by the Scots. In case you have not been around the channel for a while, the Scots were not originally from what we today call Scotland. They came from the Ulster area of Ireland in the 4th and 5th centuries and settled into the west coast of Scotland. They were a people of sailors and a kingdom of the waves. The name Scotti in Latin was referenced as a people who were raiding Britannia in the late Roman period. Over time, the Scots expanded like many of the early medieval kingdoms of northern Britain, becoming powerful. Some of their rivals were the Britons in Dumfriesshire and Cumbria, the Picts in the north and east of modern-day Scotland, and the Northumbrians in the southeast of Scotland and the northeast of England. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the kingdom of Fortu managed to centralise power over the other Pictish kingdoms, and eventually managed to defeat the Northumbrians, which had become a powerhouse in the late 6th and 7th centuries, wresting the control of the Dalriatan Scots from them and forcing them to become their sub-kings, while also gaining control of the Britons in the southwest of Scotland. But instability in the early 9th century resulted in the growth of Scots power again. The Picts were greatly weakened by the Viking raids and were defeated in 839 AD, resulting in the death of their king, his brother, and their subject king of the Dalriatan Scots. Throughout the rest of the 9th century, it appears the Vikings have the upper hand, and by the 10th century, Fortu has disappeared from the records, to be replaced by Moray and Ross in the records of the Kings of Scots. This therefore shows a shift towards the Scots having become the dominant power over the Picts, and the power of the kingdom of Alba over what had been Fortu. The Scots language became dominant over Pictish, leading to the eventual extinction of the Pictish language in favour of Gaelic. While Fortu and Pictish were gone, its successor state, Moray, was still incredibly powerful and was likely a mix of the aristocracy of both Pictish and Scottish stock. These kings of Moray were still very powerful and managed to get control of the kingdom of Alba when Macbeth became king. The political situation in early medieval Scotland was tense. While the kings of Alba were in the ascent and the other areas of Scotland had to submit to them, They in turn submitted to the powerful and dangerous King Canute, who was the ruler of the North Sea Empire, King of England, Denmark and Norway, a man who you did not want to anger. So where does Macbeth sit in all of this? Well, let's dive into his life and world now, and we'll get into how his family was wiped out by the Kings of Scots. It's likely that Macbeth was a sub-king of Moray from about 1032 to 1057, as King of Moray under Duncan I at the time that Canute travelled to Scotland. Macbeth became king the way that most early medieval kings did, by killing the previous one, in this case, Gilly, who was also his great cousin. The Northumbrians at this time were stretching their muscles and had raided Strathclyde, which was also a sub-kingdom to the Kingdom of Alba, meaning that Duncan's control was under threat. Duncan himself was unpopular as he had led raids against Thorfinn, which resulted in him losing his cavalry and being weakened. To add to the ills of his reign, he had led a disastrous raid on Durham, where his forces were defeated by the son of Uhtred, Eadwulf of Bamborough, and he fled back to Alba. The relationship between Duncan and Macbeth must have soured over this, as Macbeth must have wondered why he was sub-king to a man who couldn't win victory in battle, and at the same time he must have smelt blood. The king was weakened and there was an opportunity for Macbeth. Duncan, though, was not going to let one of his subjects get too uppity, and likely had kept an eye on Macbeth, to the point where Duncan decided to raid him. What he did not take into account was that Thorfinn sided with Macbeth and fought against him. This then resulted in Duncan dying in battle against Macbeth's troops, and with the accession of Macbeth, who ruled from the 14th of August 1040 to the 15th of August 1057 as King of Alba. Duncan and Macbeth had the same grandfather, and so were cousins. Kingship and killing family go hand in hand. Thorfinn seemed more focused on Orkney and Caithness, full of its own Viking politics, and was content to allow Macbeth to be king. At the same time, Malcolm, the future Malcolm Canmore, was just a child, roughly 8 years old. He now was taken with haste to England. It's hard to tell where he spent his formative years, but some suggest he may have been at Sigurd, Earl of Northumbria's court, as many histories believe that they were related. His mother may have been a cousin or a sister to Sigurd, or Edward the Confessor's court, where he could have been influenced by the traditions that were being imported from continental Europe, traditions that would transform Scotland and England within the next century. Macbeth himself had no children. He had married the previous King of Moray's wife and had adopted her son, Luach, as his own. While the king had to fight against Duncan's family and kill Duncan's father and brother while they attempted to protect the rights of the young King Malcolm, Duncan's son. This secured Macbeth's position. Malcolm himself will become important later. All this death, though, seems to have inspired Macbeth to acts of righteousness, and he went to Rome on pilgrimage to see the Pope, giving out alms and gifts to the poor and the needy along the way, as if it were seed, according to the chroniclers. Near the end of his rule, Macbeth seems to have started to be drawn into foreign affairs. The complex political situation in England between Godwinson and Edward the Confessor meant that the Norman exiles from Edward the Confessor's court ended up seeking peace and stability in Macbeth's court, while they were also starting to influence the Scots with their new ideas. To the south of him, Sigurd of Northumbria started a large invasion of Scotland in 1054. The battle where the armies came to a head was the Battle of the Seven Sleepers, or the Battle of Dunsinane. It occurred near Dunsinane Hill, a delightful hill fort in Perthshire. I do love hill forts and wished more of you on YouTube were as excited about them as I am. Malcolm, now fully grown, had asked Edward the Confessor for permission and support, and was even given the aid of men from the Confessor's bodyguard to defeat Macbeth and restore Malcolm as king. Sigurd supplied horsemen or mounted troops and a fleet to support the expedition. King Edward himself was not bothered by northern affairs. His eyes were firmly set on the south and across the Channel, having never set foot north of Oxford. Sigurd, though, would have wanted a thankful Scots king, one who might be willing to give lands to a Northumbrian kingsman. These dynastic ties between the Northumbrians and a future Malcolm III of Scotland led to a bloody battle. Simeon of Durham tells us they crossed the border and went through Lothian, and then crossed the River Forth near Stirling, gathering Scots rebels along the way. Malcolm led the fleet, sailing and capturing Dundee, and then went up the River Tay, while forces who may have had sympathies to his father rallied to his cause. It's unsure where Sigurd and Malcolm met, but they would have had a substantial force on their side. One Macbeth would have been wary of attacking. In fact, Shakespeare modified their tactic of moving through Britain Wood under leaf cover to hide their advance against Macbeth's forces. In the play, they cut down the wood and used them as cover as they approach. The battle was bloody and details are difficult to piece together, but the Annals of Ulster says that 3,000 Scots died and only 1,500 of Malcolm and Sigurd's forces. This would have been a substantial engagement of the age. While the Northumbrians were successful in battle, killing more Scots than they lost, Sigurd lost his son and his son-in-law in the battle, which would have ripples throughout Northumbria for centuries to come. And they managed to place another Malcolm, Malcolm of the Cumbrians, on the throne of Strathclyde, likely under Northumbrian supervision. Malcolm Canmore did get his throne at this time, becoming the king of the lowland Scots, though likely viewed as a very foreign and southern by his subjects. Macbeth escaped the battle and Sigurd returned home with dynastic problems on the horizon. It would have been these conflicts that weakened Macbeth's position, leaving him open to attack. Macbeth, though, spent the next 3 years raiding his former lands, but now, in his 50s, time was running out, and in 1057 Macbeth was defeated in battle. Malcolm III, leading an ambitious raid of his own, crossed the Grampians and ambushed Macbeth as he was returning from a raid on Aberdeenshire. Macbeth was wounded, and some say he fled the scene and died a couple of days later due to his wounds. Macbeth died on the same day that he had killed Duncan all those years before, a weird fact of history. His adopted son Luach became king after him, but the tide had well and truly turned against his dynasty, and Luach was killed in 1058 by Malcolm, having the posthumous epithet, the unfortunate, and the simple given to him. Both kings were buried at the royal burial grounds of the King of Scots on Iona and were seen as royals. Luach's son Maelschnechti became the next king of Moray after his father's death. He did his best to reassert his claim on the kingdom of Alba. Malcolm III outplayed him though, raiding his lands in 1078 and capturing his mother, his treasures and his cattle, and Schnechti only escaped with difficulty, showing that Malcolm III considered him enough of a risk to raid him, while some other academics suggest that Malcolm III forced him into a monastery until his death in 1085. Other sources suggest that he was executed. In Malcolm's eyes, there was not to be any opposition to his reign by Macbeth's dynasty. The challenge of reclaiming the kingship that Macbeth had held passed to his cousin, Angus. Angus was the last of the kings of Moray, ruling until he died in 1130. It's likely that he still had a great deal of power in Scotland, as it is recorded that the people of Moray were enough of a risk that in 1116 they were able to kill the grandson of Malcolm III, who was the nephew of Alexander I, the current King of Scots. They also managed to raid Alexander while he was holding court, though he defeated them. Angus managed to outlive Alexander I and continued to be a pain in the side of King David I, his younger brother who succeeded him, raising 5,000 men of Moray to fight against David I at the Battle of Strathrow, where they were soundly defeated and Angus was slain. This led David's commander, Edward Sigurdsson, who may have been a relation of Earl Sigurd of Northumbria, to lead an extended campaign against Moray, causing damage and for it to be subjected to the King of Scots. David finally broke the power of Moray, though, by placing it under the rule of William FitzDuncan, the son of Duncan II, grandson of Duncan I, who had grown up in Cumbria and had returned to serve his half-uncle David I. This worked well as he was granted Moray, and with David I's support settled it with French, Flemish and English followers, and knights to break the power of the former powerful Moray. The greatest sadness when it comes to Macbeth is the way he's viewed today. Shakespeare did a number on him in his day because James I and VI was descended from Banquo, and therefore it made the king look good in the eyes of his people, setting up Macbeth for the fall. Depicting Macbeth as susceptible to witches also would have pleased James I and VI, because James hated witches and even wrote books on the subject. During his lifetime, though, Macbeth was generally liked, known for his generosity and renown, and given the epithet the tall and the golden-haired one, which is very different from how we think when we hear the name Macbeth. It would not be the Pictish and Gaelic kings descended from Macbeth and the House of Moray that would lead Scotland in the 11th century, but those descended from Malcolm, who married the English Princess Margaret, and whose daughter Matilda would be the wife of Henry I of England, now influenced by the Anglo-Norman power to the south, rather than the northern traditions of the past. If you've enjoyed this video and do want to learn about a king who was horrendous, I've done one on King John, which you can see here. I also have a link tree in the description if you'd like to support me further. Until then, keep loving history and learning from the past.